Rejected dog. At auction is bought by a young man, and what happens in next. The wind howled through the cracked planks of the Hancock County auction house, a mournful wail that matched the tension gripping the room. Shadows danced wildly as lanterns swayed, their dim glow barely piercing the gloom of the concrete chamber. In the center, a German shepherd lay sprawled, ribs jutting beneath a dull coat, his scarred body a map of unspoken agony. A man in a dark coat loomed over him, his boot nudging the dog's flank with a sneer. "Move, you worthless mutt," he growled, drawing scattered laughs from the crowd. The dog didn't flinch, his eyes vacant yet piercing as if staring through the veil of death itself. Suddenly a chair scraped violently against the floor and all heads turned. Henry Sullivan stood, his Marine Corps jacket frayed at the cuffs, his voice cutting through the mockery like a blade. "I'll take him." The room froze, teetering on the edge of something unknown. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Snowflakes swirled outside the auction house, a late winter storm battering the coast of Hancock County, Maine. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool and stale tobacco. The crowd, a mix of grizzled farmers, curious townsfolk, and a few rough-looking strangers who lingered near the back. The lanterns flickered, casting jagged shadows across the concrete floor where the German shepherd lay, a pitiful heap of fur and bone. His once proud frame, honed by years of military service, had withered to a shell, his spirit seemingly snuffed out by horrors no one dared voice. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Chet with a voice hoarse from shouting, paced nervously, his desperation palpable. "Startin' bid $50. Anyone," he croaked, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. The dog didn't stir, not even as jeers erupted. "Not worth a dime." "Damaged goods!" The words hung heavy, a cruel chorus echoing off the walls. Henry Sullivan stood apart, his broad shoulders hunched beneath the weight of his own ghosts. At 34, he carried the weariness of a man twice his age, his calloused hands clenched in his pockets, his dark eyes fixed on the dog. 3 years had passed since his last deployment with the Marines, yet the echoes of Afghanistan still haunted him, sudden noises jolting him awake, nightmares painting his sleep in shades of blood and sand. The small farm he'd inherited from his grandfather, perched on the rugged edge of Frenchman's Bay, had become his refuge, a place to tend the few horses left behind and wrestle the memories that refused to fade. That night he hadn't planned to leave the farm, much less attend the auction, but 6 lines in the local paper's classifieds had seized him like a vice. Former military dog, aggressive, no training possible, final auction before euthanasia. His hands had trembled as he read it, a rage he hadn't felt since the war surging through his veins. The German shepherd's scars told a story Henry recognized too well. Marks of systematic abuse, not honorable combat. Under the auction house's flickering light, old wounds gleamed. A jagged line along his flank, a burn scar near his ear. His ribs pressed against his skin, a testament to neglect, and his eyes, those hollow, knowing eyes, mirrored the stare Henry met in his bathroom mirror each morning. It was the look of someone who'd seen too much, borne too much, and shattered beneath it all. The crowd's laughter grated against Henry's nerves, each taunt a lash against his own wounds. He'd seen military dogs treated as heroes, retired with dignity, not discarded like this. The injustice of it churned in his gut, a storm brewing behind his calm exterior. Chet's voice cracked again. $50, going once. Before he could finish, Henry's chair scraped, the sound sharp and final. The room fell silent as he rose, his face half hidden in shadow, his presence commanding despite the slump of his shoulders. "I'll take him," he said, his tone steady but laced with something haunted, something that dared anyone to challenge him. The crowd parted, their jeers fading into murmurs, curiosity and unease rippling through them. Chet blinked, caught off guard, then nodded hastily. "Sold. $50 to the man in the jacket," he stammered, relief washing over his pinched features. No one knew it then, not Chet, not the onlookers, not even Henry himself, but this moment was a spark, the beginning of a fire that would burn through secrets long buried. In the corner, Margaret Maggie Pierce watched, her arms crossed neatly over her wool coat. A veterinarian with decades of experience, she'd been tracking the dog's case, her attempts to intervene thwarted by military red tape she couldn't untangle. Her graying hair framed a face etched with concern as she studied Henry, a man she'd seen around town but never truly met. She wondered if he understood what he'd just taken on. A creature so broken it might shatter him too. Yet there was something in his stance, a quiet defiance that stirred a flicker of hope in her chest. She stepped closer, her boots soft on the concrete, intending to speak, but Henry was already moving toward the dog, his focus singular. The German shepherd's ears twitched, a subtle sign of life as Henry approached. The man crouched 6 feet away, his breath visible in the cold air, and spoke softly. "Hey, buddy. I'm Henry. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's eyes flickered toward him, a brief flash of awareness cutting through their dull depths. Henry stayed still, his training with military canines kicking in. Never rush, never loom, never show fear. The crowd watched, breath held, as if sensing the weight of this fragile exchange. Outside, the storm raged on, snow piling against the windows, sealing them all in this moment of reckoning. For Henry, it wasn't just about saving a dog. It was about reclaiming something lost, a piece of himself left behind in the dust of war. And for the dog, it was the first whisper of a chance, a lifeline thrown into the abyss. What neither could know was how this night would unravel a tapestry of pain and purpose, drawing them toward a future neither had dared imagine. The salt-laden wind whipped across Sullivan Farm, rattling the weathered shingles of the old house perched on the edge of Frenchman's Bay. It was past midnight when Henry Sullivan pulled his truck into the gravel drive. The German shepherd slumped in the passenger seat, a dark silhouette against the dashboard's faint glow. Snow crunched under Henry's boots as he stepped out, the storm from earlier now a lingering drizzle, dampening his Marine Corps jacket. He opened the passenger door, his breath fogging in the frigid air, and waited. The dog didn't move, his scarred body rigid, his eyes fixed on some unseen point, beyond the pines, swaying in the distance. Henry's chest tightened. Those eyes were too familiar, a mirror to the hollow stare he'd worn since Afghanistan. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "You're home now." The farm was a patchwork of memories, rusted tools in the barn, a sagging porch where his grandfather once smoked his pipe, the faint whinny of the 2 horses still stabled out back. Henry had come here 3 years ago, fleeing the chaos of war for this quiet corner of Maine. But peace remained elusive. Nightmares jolted him awake, the crack of gunfire blending with the crash of waves against the rocky shore. He'd ignored the VA's calls, letting their messages pile up on his answering machine, the pills they sent gathering dust in a drawer. Tonight, though, something had shifted. The auction had stirred a fire in him, a need to save something or someone, when he'd failed so many before. He'd prepared a spot in the barn, fresh straw spread over the dirt floor, a bowl of water gleaming in the moonlight filtering through the cracked window, but the dog wouldn't budge. Henry coaxed gently, extending a hand, only to see the animal tense, ears flattening slightly, a soldier bracing for a blow. "All right." Henry sighed, withdrawing his hand. "We'll do it your way." He grabbed a blanket from the truck, draped it over his shoulders, and sat on the cold ground beside the vehicle, the drizzle soaking his hair. The dog watched, unblinking, as Henry spoke softly about the farm, the horses his grandfather loved, the way the bay turned silver at dawn. Words spilled out, a lifeline thrown into the dark. Across the road, Margaret Maggie Pierce sat in her pickup, engine off, her gray eyes tracking the scene. She'd followed from the auction house, her veterinarian's instincts warring with her common sense. At 56, Maggie had seen her share of broken creatures, stray cats, injured deer, farm dogs past their prime. But this German shepherd was different. His scars weren't random. They were deliberate, a pattern of cruelty etched into his flesh. She'd tried to intervene weeks ago when he'd first surfaced in Hancock County, dumped by some shadowy military outfit, but bureaucracy had stonewalled her. Now, watching Henry, she felt a pang of unease. He was a loner, a man who barely spoke at the general store, his face etched with lines too deep for his age. Could he handle this dog, or would they drag each other deeper into their respective abysses? Hours passed, the drizzle fading into a misty haze. Henry's voice grew hoarse, his stories trailing into silence. He leaned against the truck, exhaustion tugging at his bones, when the dog shifted. A single paw lifted, then another, tentative steps crunching the snow. He stopped a few feet away, muscles taut, but his head tilted slightly, a flicker of curiosity breaking through the fear. Henry held his breath, meeting those eyes, still haunted but alive. "That's it," he whispered. "You're not Zero, you're Dusk." The name felt right, a nod to the fading light they both clung to. Maggie smiled faintly from her truck, a spark of hope igniting. Maybe, just maybe, they'd find their way. The first threads of trust wove between them that night, fragile as a spider silk, but real. Dusk didn't come closer, didn't relax fully, but he stayed, a shadow against the pines. Henry stood slowly, brushing snow from his knees, and glanced toward the house. Tomorrow. He'd try again. Bring Dusk inside, show him safety. For now, this was enough. Maggie started her engine, the rumble soft in the stillness, and drove off, her mind already racing with questions about the dog's past. Neither she nor Henry could know how this night would ripple outward, pulling them toward truths buried deep beneath the scars. Thunder rolled over Frenchman's Bay, a deep, guttural roar that shook the windows of Sullivan Farm. It was 3 nights after the auction, the sky splitting open with a coastal storm that swept in from the Atlantic, fierce and unrelenting. Inside the farmhouse, Henry sat at the kitchen table, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hands, his gaze drifting to the porch where Dusk lay. The German shepherd had edged closer each day, first to the porch steps, then beneath the overhang. But he still refused the indoors, his body pressed against the weathered boards as if guarding an invisible line. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scars crisscrossing his flank, and Henry's jaw tightened. He knew those marks weren't from battle alone. Outside, the wind howled, bending the pines and hurling rain against the house in sheets. Dusk had been restless all evening, pacing the porch, his ears twitching at every gust. Henry watched, a knot forming in his gut. He'd seen that look before, in soldiers before an ambush, in himself, before the nightmares struck. Then it came, a crack of thunder, sharp as a mortar blast, splitting the night. Dusk bolted, a blur of fur and panic, crashing into the wooden fence with a sickening thud. Blood streaked his shoulder as he tore free, disappearing into the storm's embrace. Henry leapt up, coffee spilling across the table, and grabbed his jacket. "Dusk!" he shouted, voice swallowed by the gale as he plunged into the rain. The world was chaos. Rain stung his face, mud sucked at his boots, lightning painting the farm in stark whites and blacks. He found Dusk half a mile out, trapped in a drainage ditch, his paws clawing at the slick earth, his growls lost to the wind. Blood matted his fur, a fresh wound from the fence, but it was his eyes that stopped Henry cold, wild, unseeing, trapped in some memory far worse than this storm. Henry slid into the ditch, heedless of the mud, and sat a safe distance away, rain plastering his hair to his forehead. "I know what it's like," he said, his voice cutting through the tempest. "When the thunder sounds like mortars, when every shadow's a threat. I've been there, buddy." Dusk's ears flicked, his trembling frame stilling slightly. Henry kept talking, words tumbling out, about Kandahar, the ambush that took his squad, the guilt that gnawed at him still. The storm raged, but his voice became an anchor, steady and low. Minutes stretched into an hour, the rain easing to a drizzle, and Dusk took a step toward him. Then another, collapsing a few feet away, exhausted but present. Henry's heart thudded, a mix of relief and awe washing over him. This wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall between them. Margaret Pierce's truck rattled up the drive just as the sky cleared, dawn breaking in muted grays over the bay. She'd been restless all night, the storm stirring her worries about the dog. Stepping out, she saw Henry and Dusk in the ditch, mud-streaked and weary, and hurried over, her medical bag in hand. "He's hurt," she called, crouching to assess the gash. Dusk flinched at her approach, a low growl rumbling in his throat, and she froze. "Easy, boy," she soothed, glancing at Henry. "He won't let me touch him, not with this." She gestured to her bag, realization dawning. It's not just fear, it's trauma. Whatever they did to him involved medical gear. Henry nodded, his mind racing. The scars, the panic, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't yet solved. Maggie bandaged the wound from a distance, using a makeshift wrap Henry tossed to Dusk, who accepted it warily. "We'll figure it out," Henry said, more to himself than her, his voice firm with resolve. Maggie met his gaze, seeing the soldier beneath the farmer, and felt a surge of cautious hope. The storm had tested them, but it had also bound them closer, a tether forged in shared survival. As they trudged back to the farm, Dusk limping beside Henry, the first rays of sunlight glinted off the bay, promising a new day and new battles ahead. The wood stove crackled in Henry Sullivan's kitchen, casting a warm glow over the pine walls of the farmhouse on Frenchman's Bay. It was a week after the storm, the air still heavy with the scent of damp earth and sea salt drifting through the cracked window. Henry sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, steam curling upward like a fragile prayer. Across the room, Dusk lay on an old blanket near the door, his wounded shoulder bandaged, his breathing steady but shallow. The German shepherd's eyes followed Henry's every move, a quiet vigilance that spoke of both wariness and something new, curiosity perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of trust. Outside, the pines stood sentinel against a slate-gray sky, their branches whispering secrets in the wind. Henry's mind churned, replaying Maggie's words from the ditch. Whatever they did to him involved medical gear. The scars on Dusk's body, jagged lines, burn marks, a puncture near his ribs, weren't random battle wounds. They were deliberate, precise, the work of someone who knew how to break a spirit without killing the body. He'd seen military dogs in Afghanistan, proud, fearless partners treated with respect. This was different, a betrayal that gnawed at him, stirring a rage he'd buried deep since his last deployment. The coffee grew cold as he stared at Dusk, the dog's hollow gaze mirroring his own sleepless nights, the weight of memories neither could escape. Margaret Pierce arrived just past noon, her truck kicking up gravel as she pulled into the drive. She stepped into the kitchen, her wool coat dusted with pine needles, a thick manila envelope tucked under her arm. Her gray eyes softened at the sight of Dusk, but her jaw tightened as she set the envelope on the table. "Military finally coughed up some records," she said, her voice low, bitter. "Took a friend in Augusta pulling strings, but it's something." Henry slid the envelope toward him, his fingers trembling slightly as he broke the seal. Papers spilled out, redacted pages stamped with official seals, dates blurred, names blacked out. But one detail stood clear. The dog's real name was Rex, a German shepherd with 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, highly decorated until a 6-month gap erased him from the books. Maggie pointed to a faded photo clipped to the file. A younger Rex, ears pricked, standing beside a Marine unit in desert dust. Henry's breath caught. He knew that landscape, those jagged hills of Kandahar province. 3 years ago, his squad had been there, caught in an ambush that left half his men dead, their screams still echoing in his nightmares. He was there, Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. "The day we lost them." Maggie nodded, her expression grim. "There's more. Look at this." She slid a training log across the table, timestamps showing Rex worked 20 hours a day. Impossible, abusive, a regimen designed to break even the strongest. Henry's fists clenched, the paper crumpling under his grip. Dusk stirred, a high-pitched whine escaping his throat, his ears flattening. Henry turned, startled, and saw the dog pawing at his neck, claws scraping the thick fur. "Easy, boy," he soothed, crossing the room in 3 strides. Kneeling beside Dusk, he ran his fingers gently over the spot, feeling something hard beneath the skin. A metal tag, embedded and overgrown, unnoticed until now. Maggie joined him, her breath quickening. "Call the clinic," Henry said, his voice firm with urgency. "We need to see what that is." Dusk's eyes locked on his, a flash of recognition cutting through the pain, as if he too sensed the weight of this discovery. At Maggie's clinic, under careful sedation, she extracted the tag, a military ID, numbers worn but legible, etched with a name. Handler, Major William Bill Carver. Henry's face drained of color, his mind racing back to rumors he'd heard in the Corps. Carver, a hard-edged officer investigated for ethics violations, discharged years ago but never convicted. "That's impossible," he muttered, meeting Maggie's wide-eyed stare. Everyone knew him. Enhanced training program, whispers about his methods, but nothing stuck. Dusk whimpered as he stirred from the sedation, his gaze finding Henry's, a silent plea woven into the trust they'd begun to build. "Until now," Maggie finished, her voice trembling with resolve. The tag was a key, a thread to unravel a tapestry of cruelty, and they would follow it. The kitchen grew quiet again that evening, the wood stove's glow dimming as Henry sat with the tag in his hand, dusk resting at his feet. A storm was brewing, not in the sky but in their shared past, a reckoning that would demand answers. Maggie left with a promise to dig deeper, her footsteps fading into the night. Henry knew this was more than a rescue now. It was a mission, one that would test them both. The moon hung low over Frenchman's Bay, its silver light rippling across the waves that lapped at the rocky shore below Sullivan Farm. It was late, the air crisp with the tang of seaweed and pine. The world hushed, save for the rhythmic crash of the tide. Henry stood on the beach, a narrow strip of pebbles and driftwood stretching before the farmhouse, his boots sinking into the damp earth. Dusk stood beside him, closer than ever before, his bandaged shoulder gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The German shepherd's ears twitched at the distant call of a gull, but his eyes stayed on Henry, a quiet steadiness replacing the panic of days past. The tag's revelation weighed heavy on them both, a silent bond forged in the shadow of shared scars. Henry knelt, the pebbles cold against his knees, and met Dusk's gaze. "Bill Carver," he said softly, the name bitter on his tongue. "Whatever he did to you, I'll find him. You deserve justice. They all do." Dusk tilted his head, a low whine rumbling in his chest, as if he understood. Henry's hand hovered near the dog's flank, hesitating, then rested lightly there, a touch Dusk didn't flinch from. The moment stretched fragile and profound, a vow sealed under the vast Maine sky. Henry rose, glancing at the farmhouse, its porch light a beacon in the dark. "Come on, buddy," he said, stepping toward it. For the first time Dusk followed, his paws crunching the gravel, and crossed the threshold, lying near the door, a tentative claim on safety. Inside the kitchen felt warmer, the wood stove still smoldering from the day's fire. Henry sank into a chair, exhaustion tugging at him, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind replayed the tag, Carver's name, the redacted files, pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a darkness he'd only glimpsed in the core. Dusk settled on the blanket, his presence a comfort, a reminder of why this mattered. Henry had failed his squad in Kandahar, or so he'd believed, but saving Dusk, Rex, offered a chance to right a different wrong. The dog's trust, hard-won and precious, fueled a resolve he hadn't felt in years. A knock shattered the stillness, sharp and unexpected. Henry tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife on the table, but he relaxed as Eleanor Ellie Grayson stepped through the door, her silver hair glinting in the porch light. At 62, Ellie carried a quiet strength, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. She clutched a worn envelope, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I heard about the dog. From Maggie. I had to come." Henry gestured to a chair, and she sat, her gaze falling on Dusk. "That's him, isn't it?" she whispered, tears welling. "Thomas wrote about him. Rex. Said he saved 3 of his men before—" Her voice broke, and Dusk rose, padding over to press his head against her hand, a gentle, deliberate gesture that stole her breath. Ellie opened the envelope, revealing letters from her late husband, Thomas Grayson, Henry's squadmate, killed in that Kandahar ambush. "He mentioned a dog," she said, handing Henry a faded page. "Said it was special, but something wasn't right with the program." Henry read, his heart pounding. Rex disobeyed orders to warn us. Saved lives. They punished him for it. The words confirmed what the tag implied. Carver's cruelty had targeted Rex for his courage. Ellie wiped her eyes, her touch lingering on Dusk's fur. Thomas would have wanted this, she said, for him to be safe. Henry nodded, a lump rising in his throat. Ellie's arrival wove their pasts tighter, a thread linking Dusk to the men he'd lost. As she left, promising to return with more of Thomas's notes, Henry looked at Dusk, now lying closer to the stove, his eyes half closed but alert. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured, and Dusk's tail thumped once, a small but seismic shift. Outside, the moon sank lower, casting long shadows over the bay, a silent witness to the promise that would drive them forward, toward Carver, toward truth, toward healing. The sun rose over Hancock, Maine, a pale orb shrouded in mist that rolled off Frenchman's Bay, softening the edges of the clapboard houses lining Main Street. The town was a quiet patchwork of stone walls, a steepled church, and the general store where locals swapped stories over coffee. A week had passed since Ellie Grayson's visit, and whispers about Henry Sullivan's German Shepherd had begun to ripple through the community, carried on the salt breeze like the tolling of church bells. By mid-morning, the store's wooden porch creaked under the weight of curious townsfolk, old fishermen in oilskins, women with baskets of bread, a few kids clutching nickels for candy, all drawn by the tail of a broken dog and the solitary Marine who'd claimed him. Henry stood on his farm's porch, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands, watching Dusk nose the gravel near the fence. The dog's limp had eased, his shoulder healing under Maggie Pierce's care, and he'd taken to sleeping just inside the kitchen door, a small victory Henry cherished. But the peace felt fragile, a thin veneer over the storm brewing in his mind since the tag's discovery. Major Bill Carver, a name that festered like a wound. Dusk's ears pricked suddenly, his gaze shifting to the road, and Henry followed it, spotting a familiar figure hobbling up the drive. George Geo Ramsey, a 70-year-old ex-K9 handler, leaned on a cane, his weathered face set in a scowl that softened when he saw Dusk. "Heard about your dog," Geo rasped, his voice rough from decades of barking orders. "Knew Carver's work the minute Maggie described those scars." Henry invited him in, the kitchen filling with the scent of pine and Geo's pipe tobacco as they sat. Dusk edged closer, sniffing Geo's boots, a rare sign of ease with a stranger. Geo's eyes narrowed, tracing the dog's wounds. "Lost 2 of mine to his enhanced training," he said, bitterness lacing his words. "Good dogs, labeled unstable when they started flinching at his damn shock collars, disappeared after that." Henry's grip tightened on his mug, the pieces clicking into place. Carver's cruelty wasn't an anomaly. It was a system. Word spread fast in Hancock. By noon, the general store buzzed with more than gossip. Mrs. Hilda Crane, a widow who baked pies for the church, arrived at the farm with a slab of beef wrapped in butcher paper. "For your hero," she said, her arthritic hands trembling as she handed it to Henry. Dusk accepted it gently, his manners piercing her stern facade, and she wiped a tear before bustling off. Kids from the schoolhouse, led by 10-year-old Tommy Ellis, showed up next, their pockets jingling with coins from a lemonade stand. "For Dusk's vet bills," Tommy declared, thrusting a tin can at Henry. The community's warmth seeped into the farm, a tide of goodwill that caught Henry off guard, thawing the isolation he'd worn like armor. Maggie arrived late that afternoon, her truck loaded with bandages and a notebook scribbled with questions about Carver. She found Henry and Geo on the porch, Dusk lying between them, his head resting on his paws. "Town's talking," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "They're calling him one of ours." Geo grunted, lighting his pipe. "Damn right he is. Military dogs deserve better than Carver's butcher shop." Maggie nodded, her gaze drifting to the road, where a black SUV idled, its tinted windows glinting in the fading light. "They're watching," she murmured, unease creeping into her voice. Henry followed her stare, his pulse quickening, Carver's shadow was closing in, and Hancock's awakening might not go unnoticed. That evening, as the mist thickened over the bay, the farm glowed with a quiet defiance. Hilda's beef simmered in a pot, the kids' coin sat on the table, and Gio's stories of lost dogs fueled Henry's resolve. Dusk lifted his head, ears alert, sensing the shift in the air. A community rallying, a threat looming. Henry knew this was no longer just his fight, it was theirs, a bond forged in the salt and soil of Maine. The SUV lingered until dusk, then vanished into the fog, a silent promise of trouble ahead. Night fell heavy over Sullivan Farm, the fog rolling in thick from Frenchman's Bay, cloaking the pines in a ghostly shroud. Henry stood on the porch, the chill seeping through his jacket, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the gravel drive. Dusk paced beside him, his ears twitching at every rustle, his healed shoulder flexing with a strength that belied his scars. 2 days had passed since Hancock's rally, the town's support a steady hum in Henry's mind, but the black SUV's presence lingered like a storm cloud. Inside, the kitchen lamp cast a faint glow, its light swallowed by the mist, leaving the farm an island in a sea of uncertainty. The sound came first, a low rumble, tires crunching gravel, headlights slicing through the fog. 3 men emerged from the SUV, their silhouettes sharp against the haze, their civilian clothes doing little to mask their military bearing. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a clipped voice, stepped forward, his boots thudding on the porch steps. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, smooth but cold. "Major Carver wants his property returned. No need for trouble." Dusk's growl rumbled deep, his body tensing, and Henry's hand rested lightly on the dog's back, steadying them both. "He's not property," Henry replied, his tone flat but edged with steel. "He's a soldier, and he's staying." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That dog's a liability, unstable, dangerous. We're offering compensation." Behind him the others shifted, hands near their belts, a threat unspoken but clear. Dusk bared his teeth, stepping forward to shield Henry, his military training snapping into place. Not fear, but defiance. Henry's pulse raced, memories of standoffs in dusty villages flooding back, but he held his ground, his voice rising. 27 dogs, wasn't it? Eliminated to cover Carver's tracks. You think I don't know what you're hiding? The man's facade flickered, surprise flashing across his face, and the fog seemed to thicken with the weight of the accusation. Headlights flared again, this time from the road, a pickup truck, then another, engines roaring as they skidded to a stop. Gio Ramsey leapt from the first, cane in one hand, a flashlight in the other, his voice booming. "Get off this land, now!" Behind him, 6 veterans spilled out, men and women Henry recognized from town, their faces etched with the same resolve he'd once seen in combat. The leader hesitated, outnumbered, his men glancing at each other. "This isn't over," he spat, retreating to the SUV, tires spinning as they vanished into the night. Inside, Ellie Grayson waited, her hands trembling as she spread Thomas's letters on the kitchen table. "I couldn't stay away," she said, her voice soft but firm. "After what Maggie told me. I went through everything." She handed Henry a notebook, its pages yellowed, detailing Carver's program. Dogs pushed beyond limits, labeled unstable, quietly disposed of. 27 at least, she confirmed, echoing Henry's words. Thomas saw it starting. Henry read, his jaw tightening, the numbers searing into him like brands. Dusk pressed against his leg, a silent partner in the fight, his warmth grounding Henry's rising anger. Gio sank into a chair, his cane tapping the floor. "Carver's cleaning house," he said, his pipe unlit but clenched between his teeth. "He knows you've got something. Probably that tag." Maggie joined them, her notebook open, her voice steady despite the tension. "We need more. Proof that sticks." Henry nodded, his gaze drifting to Dusk, who stood watch at the window, ears pricked. The dog's loyalty, his quiet strength, was a beacon in the fog, a reminder of what they were, fighting for. As the night deepened, the farm settled into an uneasy calm. The veteran's trucks a silent guard outside. Henry sat with Dusk, the notebook in his lap, Ellie's words echoing. Thomas would have wanted this. The first stand had been won, but Carver's retreat was a warning, not a surrender. The battle was coming, and Hancock's defiance would be tested. Dusk's tail thumped once, a small sound in the stillness, sealing their pact. Together, they'd face whatever lay ahead. The training facility near Augusta, Maine sprawled under a slate-gray sky, its modern steel buildings a stark contrast to the pine-dotted hills beyond. It was mid-morning, 2 weeks after the standoff at Sullivan Farm, and the air buzzed with anticipation as military observers, private contractors, and foreign buyers gathered in a sleek viewing area. Henry Sullivan stood at the edge of the crowd, his Marine Corps jacket swapped for a plain coat, a forged credential from FBI agent Daniel Dan Harper pinned to his chest. Beside him, Dusk wore a tactical vest Geo Ramsey had provided, his graying fur bristling but his stance calm, a soldier reborn. The German shepherd's eyes scanned the kennels in the distance, a flicker of recognition tightening his frame, and Henry rested a hand on his back, whispering, "Just 15 minutes, buddy. That's all we need." The facility hummed with activity. Handlers prepped dogs for the showcase, their barks echoing off the metal walls, while security teams swept the perimeter. Henry's pulse thumped as he spotted Ellie Grayson weaving through the crowd, her silver hair tucked under a scarf, a camera slung around her neck masking a transmitter feeding everything to Dan's team. Maggie Pierce waited in a van outside, her voice crackling through Henry's earpiece. "Stay in position until it starts." The plan was simple but razor-thin. Expose Carver's crimes in front of witnesses, let the truth unravel his empire. Yet the weight of it pressed on Henry. The memory of Kandahar and Dusk's scars fueling a fire he couldn't douse. At precisely 9, Major Bill Carver took the stage, his tailored suit crisp, his voice booming over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the future of tactical canine training." The crowd leaned in, impressed by his polish, oblivious to the rot beneath. Henry's jaw tightened as Carver touted success rates, his lies smooth as oil. Dusk's ears pricked suddenly, his nose twitching, and Henry followed his gaze to the kennels. Handlers were moving dogs out the back, sedated forms loaded into a van. "Maggie," he hissed into the comms, "they're erasing evidence. Back kennels now." Her reply came sharp. "Accessing feeds, damn it, you're right." Henry signaled Ellie, who nodded, and began distributing Thomas's letters and Maggie's medical records, her hand steady despite the tremor in her breath. Henry and Dusk slipped toward the kennels, the crowd's murmur fading behind them. 2 handlers blocked their path, one lowering a tranquilizer gun, uncertainty creasing his brow. "Stand down," Henry commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a battlefield. "Federal investigation in progress." The younger handler hesitated, peering at Dusk. "Wait, is that Rex? They said he was euthanized." Dusk stood tall, his presence a living rebuke, and the handler stepped back, doubt clouding his face. Carver's voice cut through the tension, closer now. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" He rounded the corner with 2 security guards, his composure faltering at the sight of Dusk. "Well, Walker," he said, recovering with a smirk, "I expected something more dramatic." Henry met his gaze, unflinching. "No dramatics needed, Major. Just the truth. About the dogs you've buried, the lives you've destroyed." Carver laughed, dismissive, but his eyes darted to the growing crowd drawn by the commotion. Ellie's voice rang out, clear and steady. These records show what happens to dogs that don't meet his standards: abused, eliminated. Maggie emerged, her medical files in hand. They weren't failures. They were broken deliberately. The younger handler spoke up, voice shaking. "Sir, what are we doing with these retired dogs?" The question hung, a crack in Carver's facade. He sneered, "That dog's unstable. Watch." He pulled a high-frequency device from his pocket, its whine piercing the air, a tool of torture from Dusk's past. Dusk's ears flattened, but he didn't cower. He stepped forward, sitting in a formal military stance, his dignity unshaken. Henry's voice was quiet but firm. "He's not your weapon anymore, Carver. He's a soldier, and he's chosen his side." The crowd erupted, phones recording, military police summoned by a senior officer's nod. Carver lunged, drawing a concealed pistol, but Dusk moved faster, disarming him with a precise leap, pinning him without a bite. "It's over," Henry said as MPs cuffed Carver, his empire crumbling under the weight of witnesses. Dusk returned to Henry's side, his vest gleaming, a testament to resilience. Dan Harper stepped forward, badge flashing, sealing the victory. But as they turned away, a distant spark flared near the kennels, a warning of the fire to come. Midnight cloaked the Augusta facility in silence, the crowd long dispersed, leaving only the hum of generators and the faint yips of kenneled dogs. Henry stood near the maintenance shed, Dusk at his side, the adrenaline of the showdown still coursing through them. Dan Harper's team secured Carver in custody, while Maggie and Ellie cataloged evidence in a van nearby. The air smelled of pine and diesel, a deceptive calm after the storm of exposure. But Dusk's ears twitched, his body tensing, and Henry felt it too. A shift, a threat lurking in the shadows. Then came the crackle, a flicker of orange licking the kennel roof, smoke curling into the night sky. "Fire!" Henry shouted, sprinting toward the blaze as shouts erupted from Dan's agents. A figure darted away, a Carver loyalist, torching the last of the evidence. Flames spread fast, fueled by dry wood and chemicals. The kennels, a tinderbox of panic. Handlers stumbled out, coughing, but two sedated German shepherds remained trapped, their whimpers piercing the chaos. Dusk bolted before Henry could react, disappearing into the smoke-filled building, his vest a fleeting gleam. "Dusk, no!" Henry yelled, his voice raw. But the dog was gone, driven by an instinct deeper than fear. Inside, the heat was a living thing, clawing at Dusk's fur, smoke stinging his lungs. He moved with purpose, years of training guiding him through the haze, his nose finding the sedated dogs slumped in their crates. He nudged them, barking sharply, rousing them from their stupor. Flames roared overhead, beams groaning under the strain, but Dusk pressed on, guiding the pair toward the exit. Henry watched from outside, heart hammering, the fire's roar drowning his calls. A beam crashed, splitting the path, and the two dogs staggered out, collapsing into waiting arms. Dusk was nowhere in sight. Smoke thickened, the roof sagging, and Henry lunged forward, only to be held back by Dan. "It's coming down!" the agent shouted, but Henry's eyes were fixed on the inferno, Dusk's shadow flickering within. Then a crash, a wall buckled under Dusk's weight, his body slamming against it until it gave way, an escape forged through sheer will. He stumbled out, singed and gasping, collapsing yards from the blaze as the structure caved in behind him. Henry broke free, dropping to his knees beside Dusk, his hands shaking as he cradled the dog's head. "You idiot!" he choked, tears cutting through the soot on his face. "You brave, stupid idiot!" Maggie raced over, her medical bag spilling open, her voice steady despite the panic. Smoke inhalation severe. Burns on his left side. We need to move him now. Handlers carried the other dogs to safety, their eyes wide with awe at Dusk's heroism, but Henry saw only his partner, limp and struggling. The van screeched up, Dan at the wheel, and they lifted Dusk inside, Maggie working frantically as they sped toward Hancock's clinic. Henry sat in the back, Dusk's head in his lap, whispering, "Don't you dare give up. We've come too far." Dusk's eyes, pained but fierce, locked on his, a silent vow to fight. The fire raged behind them, a final act of desperation, snuffed out by Dusk's courage. But as the van tore through the night, Henry knew the cost might be too high, the victory too fragile. The clinic loomed ahead, a beacon of hope in the dark, and the battle for Dusk's life was just beginning. The Hancock Veterinary Clinic glowed starkly against the pre-dawn dark, its white walls bathed in the cold fluorescence of overhead lights. Inside the waiting room was a hush of held breaths, the air thick with antiseptic and the faint tang of smoke clinging to Henry Sullivan's clothes. He sat motionless on a metal chair, his soot-streaked hands clasped tight, his eyes fixed on the double doors leading to the emergency bay. Dusk lay beyond them, his powerful frame now fragile under tubes and monitors, fighting the smoke and burns that threatened to steal him away. The clock ticked past 3 a.m., each second a hammer blow to Henry's chest, the weight of potential loss cracking the soldier's composure he'd worn for years. Maggie Pierce emerged periodically, her face a mask of professional calm, though her gray eyes betrayed exhaustion and worry. "He's fighting hard," she said on her latest update, her voice gentle but firm. "The next 24 hours are critical. Smoke damage to his lungs is severe, burns significant. We're doing everything." Henry nodded, unable to speak, his throat raw from shouting into the fire and whispering pleas in the van. Dusk had saved those dogs, saved them all, in a way, but at what cost? The guilt gnawed at him. He should have stopped him, should have been faster. It was Kandahar all over again, the helplessness of watching brothers fall. Outside, the parking lot filled with shadows, Hancock's people, drawn by the news of Dusk's heroism. Mrs. Hilda Crane arrived first, her arms laden with a thermos of coffee and a basket of muffins, her stern face softened by tears. "For you and the staff," she murmured, pressing the thermos into Henry's hands. Geo Ramsey followed, his cane tapping the linoleum as he settled beside Henry, a silent pillar of understanding. Kids from the schoolhouse, led by Tommy Ellis, gathered under the awning, their small hands clutching candles that flickered against the Maine wind. "For Dusk," Tommy said, his voice small but fierce. And Henry managed a nod, the warmth of their presence piercing his fog of fear. Ellie Grayson slipped in quietly, carrying Thomas's old service flag, its faded stars a testament to sacrifice. Without a word, she draped it over Henry's shoulders, the weight of it breaking something inside him. Tears spilled down his cheeks, the first he'd shed since returning from war, and he whispered, "I failed him, Ellie. Just like I failed them." She knelt beside him, her hand firm on his arm. "You gave him a reason to fight. Thomas would have said the same." Geo's gruff voice joined in, steady as granite. "He chose to go in, Henry, like any soldier would for his own. You didn't fail. You gave him back his soul." The night stretched on, a vigil of coffee cups and whispered prayers. Maggie worked tirelessly, her team adjusting oxygen levels, treating burns with a precision born of desperation. Through the observation window, Henry glimpsed dusk, his chest rising faintly, his singed fur stark against the white sheets. "He's fighting to get back to you," Maggie said during a quiet moment, her hand brushing Henry's shoulder. "I didn't think either of you'd make it this far, but you've healed each other." Her words sank deep, a lifeline in the dark, and Henry pressed his forehead to the glass, willing dusk to hold on. As dawn crept over the bay, painting the sky in muted pinks, the community's resolve hardened. Hilda organized a rotation, someone always present, a constant watch for both Dusk and Henry. Tommy's classmates taped "Save Dusk" signs to the windows, their crayon scrawls a burst of hope. But inside the bay, Dusk's vitals faltered. His breathing shallow, and the team rushed to stabilize him. Henry stood at the window, his voice a broken whisper. "We're supposed to heal together, buddy. Don't leave me now." The candles outside flickered, a fragile glow against the coming day, and the fight hung in the balance. Frost glazed the clinic's windows as dawn broke over Hancock, the first light filtering through a haze of coastal mist. Henry Sullivan stood at the observation window, his breath fogging the glass, his hands pressed against it as if he could reach through to dusk. The German shepherd lay still, monitors beeping erratically, his burned side bandaged, his spirit teetering on the edge. Maggie Pierce emerged from the bay, her face drawn but resolute. "He's stabilizing, barely," she said, her voice a thread of hope. "The community's support, the equipment they've funded, it's making a difference." Henry turned, seeing the waiting room packed with familiar faces, Gio, Ellie, Hilda, Tommy, all united in a quiet, fierce vigil. Dan Harper arrived then, his FBI badge glinting under the fluorescent lights, a classified file tucked under his arm. "This was buried deep," he said, spreading the papers on a table littered with coffee cups. "Explains why Carver wanted him gone." The file detailed Rex's last mission in Kandahar, assigned to Thomas Grayson's unit during Henry's final deployment. Henry's hands shook as he read. Rex had detected the ambush, his agitation clear, but his handler, under Carver's orders, ignored the warning, forcing him forward with a shock collar. Rex broke free, racing to alert Thomas's squad, saving lives before the first shots rang out. Dan's voice was grim. Carver's enhanced training was about control, not instinct. Rex's defiance threatened his whole program, proved natural loyalty beat forced compliance. Maggie added, flipping through old medical reports, "The injuries after weren't just from combat. Corrective punishment. Carver's doing." Henry's gaze snapped to Dusk, the dog's pained eyes meeting his through the glass, and a flood of memory hit. Kandahar's dust, the screams, the fallback point his squad had held. "He was trying to lead them to us," Henry rasped, realization dawning. "The safe route. I was there." Ellie handed him Thomas's journal, her voice steady despite the tears. "Mike wrote this the day before he died. Rex's disobedience saved us. He's a hero, not a failure." Henry read, the words searing into him. Rex punished for courage, branded unstable to silence him. "All this time," he whispered, "I carried the guilt, but you were fighting too." Dusk's tail thumped weakly, a faint spark of life, and the room stilled, the bond between them shimmering with new meaning. They weren't just survivors. They were warriors of the same battle, tied by a day that had shaped them both. Dan straightened, his tone firm. "This changes everything. With this, we can overhaul the system. Make sure no dog suffers like him." Maggie smiled faintly, watching Dusk stir. "He's given us a blueprint for healing, for justice." The community rallied closer, Hilda pouring coffee, Geo murmuring to the kids about military dogs. Then a gasp. Maggie rushed back as Dusk's eyes opened fully, his chest rising stronger. Henry stumbled to the bay, allowed inside at last, and knelt beside him. "Look at them out there," he said, voice breaking, gesturing to the crowd. "All for you, buddy." Dusk's tail thumped again. A slow rhythm of defiance. His gaze locked on Henry. A promise kept, a fight won. The clinic buzzed with quiet joy, the dawn brightening, and Henry felt the weight lift, not gone, but shared. The truth from Kandahar had freed them both, a bridge from past to future, and Dusk's survival was their victory. The autumn sun dipped low over Sullivan Farm, now Duskhaven Rehabilitation Center, casting a golden glow across the rolling hills of Hancock County, Maine. 2 years had passed since the long night at the clinic, and the modest homestead had transformed into a sanctuary of healing, its weathered barns renovated into a state-of-the-art facility framed by pines and the ever-present whisper of Frenchman's Bay. Henry Sullivan stood on the porch, his hands tucked into a faded jacket, watching a new group arrive. 3 veterans and their retired military dogs, their faces a mix of weariness and tentative hope. Beside him, Dusk sat tall, gray creeping into his muzzle, his scarred body a testament to battles fought and won. The German shepherd's eyes, once hollow, now gleamed with quiet wisdom, a beacon for those stepping onto this hallowed ground. The farm buzzed with life. Handlers guided dogs through gentle exercises in the yard. Veterans shared coffee on benches overlooking the bay, and the air carried the scent of pine and hay. Duskhaven had become a pioneer, a place where broken warriors, human and canine, mended together under a philosophy born from Henry and Dusk's journey. Maggie Pierce oversaw the medical wing, her clinic a cornerstone of the operation, her research on trauma recovery, earning nods from veterinary journals worldwide. Geo Ramsey, cane prop nearby, led training sessions, his gruff voice softened by pride as he watched dogs reclaim their spirits. Ellie Grayson, the center's outreach coordinator, moved among the newcomers, her silver hair glinting as she handed out packets detailing the program, Thomas's legacy woven into every page. This day was special, marked by the unveiling of a plaque Ellie had insisted upon. She stood beside Henry now, her hands clutching a cloth-draped frame, her voice steady as she addressed the small crowd, veterans, staff, and Hancock townsfolk, who'd never stopped believing. 2 years ago, a dog and a man showed us what courage looks like, she said, pulling the cloth away. The plaque gleamed in the fading light. In honor of Thomas Grayson and Rex Dusk, heroes of loyalty and redemption. Dusk's ears twitched at his name, and he rose, padding to Ellie's side, pressing his head against her hand. A gesture that drew a collective sigh from the onlookers. Henry's throat tightened, the weight of their shared past settling into something lighter, something whole. The center's first success story lingered in Henry's mind. A Belgian Malinois named Scout, once slated for euthanasia after combat stress. Dusk had approached him with patient authority, guiding him through panic with a calm only a survivor could offer. Within months, Scout bonded with a veteran battling PTSD, their recovery a mirror to Henry and Dusk's own. "These dogs don't need retraining," Henry often told visiting military officials, his voice firm with conviction. "They need to remember who they were before the trauma, their loyalty, their heart. That's what we give them here." The success rate spoke volumes. Over 90% of Dusk Haven's dogs transitioned to civilian life, their handlers reporting peace they hadn't known in years. Dusk played his part with an instinct that defied explanation. He moved among the new arrivals now, his gait slower but steady, approaching a young veteran struggling with a skittish German shepherd. The man's hand shook, his voice sharp with frustration, but Dusk sat nearby, his presence a silent balm. The dog calmed, mirroring Dusk's stillness, and the veteran's shoulders eased, a faint smile breaking through. "He gets it," the man murmured later, sitting with Henry on the porch, "like he's been there." Henry nodded, his hand resting on Dusk's head. "He has." The legacy stretched beyond the farm. The Military Working Dog Protection Act, spurred by Dusk's story and Dan Harper's evidence, had passed Congress a year ago, ensuring care and oversight for service dogs, funding for retirement, bans on abusive training, a tracking system to prevent disappearances. Carver's trial had exposed his network, toppling a system that had thrived in shadows, and Dusk Haven became a model for reform, its methods adopted by military programs nationwide. International delegations visited, their notebooks filled with lessons from a dog once deemed worthless. As the sun sank, painting the bay in hues of purple and gold, Henry and Dusk remained on the porch, the crowd thinning as evening settled. Ellie joined them, placing Thomas's journal beside the plaque. A library dedicated to his memory now housed it, a resource for handlers and advocates. "Mike would be proud," she said softly, her hand brushing Dusk's fur. "You finished what he started." Henry smiled, a rare lightness in his chest. The guilt of Kandahar had faded, not gone but transformed into purpose, shared with the dog who'd walked him back from the edge. A final moment sealed the day. Dusk rose, his gray muzzle catching the last light, and rested his head on Henry's knee. A gesture simple yet profound, a soldier's trust unbroken by time. Henry's hand settled there, steady and sure, and they watched the horizon together. The bay's waves a steady heartbeat beneath the pines. The auction house, the fire, the battles, they were scars now, not wounds, etched into a story of redemption. Hancock's candles, once lit in vigil, had become a flame of hope, carried forward by every soul Dusk touched. The farm grew quiet, the newcomers settling into cabins, the staff locking up for the night. Dusk's breathing slowed, a contented rhythm, and Henry leaned back, the porch creaking beneath him. They'd healed together, not just survived, and in that healing they'd built something enduring, a haven where second chances thrived, where loyalty and love outlasted pain. The stars emerged over Frenchman's Bay, a silent witness to their triumph, and for the first time in years Henry felt at peace. Dusk's warmth a steady anchor beside him. The story was complete, a circle closed, its echoes rippling far beyond the shores of Maine. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next videos.